won't give you a plane, we won't give you a tank. There's this sort of strange offensive, defensive category of weapons. But when you're using a weapon to defend a country, all weapons are defensive, aren't they? Is it not possible for us to get our acts together and give Ukrainians even more hardware than we are doing?
Yes, I think I absolutely can answer that question. We ought to be doing that, sending them some heavier weapons, because you're quite right that often you have to attack in order to defend yourself. In fact, I called for that in the column I wrote in the Times last week, and I'm glad to say there was some movement on that since then. There was a conference of the donor military, the countries that are giving weapons to Ukraine, hosted by our defense secretary last Thursday. And they did agree some changes to this, including potentially sending some Soviet-built tanks to Ukraine. That's because they know how to operate those tanks already. And sending some artillery, longer-range missiles, and so on. We don't know all the details of what was discussed, and there's perfectly good military reasons not to advertise all those things. But there does seem to have been a change there, and I think we just heard the description of the battle that is coming in the east, in the Donbass, and that continues to rage around Mariupol. And the Ukrainians do need to sustain a conflict which might last a long time in those areas. They do need some of those heavier weapons.
What's delaying it then, William? Because you could make this argument that I understand that we don't want to engage President Putin directly. That's the great red line for NATO countries. Yeah. I do understand that, although I think there are arguments around that still to be made, perhaps. But what's the delay? Because we could have sent MiG-29s a month ago and actually trained people to use them in that time. And we heard actually from Tom Tugendhat, we could actually train them to use American planes in the time that we've been waiting around. Is it a country that's delaying this? Is it the organization of NATO? If you were Foreign Secretary, could you not say, I want to send tanks, I want to send planes to Ukraine tomorrow?
Well, a lot of these things do require agreement of an alliance. In the case of planes, you see, these planes that were going to be provided by Poland, that were taken to a German airbase, a NATO airbase, but to do it requires, in a NATO operation, the agreement of the United States that was not willing to send planes into what might be an instant dogfight with the Russians. So you can't just say, oh, I'm the British Foreign or Defense Secretary and I'm going to do this. There's a lot you can do, but you can't just necessarily fly an air force into Ukraine. It's also important to bear in mind, I mean, I'm on your side, by the way, on the questions you're asking, as you can tell, but just to explain the situation, the initial weapons that were sent, like these very, very effective anti-tank missiles that Britain has sent, and other weapons the United States has sent, these weapons were sent sort of on the assumption that the Ukrainians would be resisting a Russian occupation of a large part of the country, more of the country than they've been able to occupy, more of an insurgency. Well, it's turned out, as we know, the Ukrainian armed forces have performed one of the great feats of history, really, in fighting off the Russian army from Kyiv. It is an extraordinary military achievement. So now they need the heavier weapons for a different kind of war than what was being contemplated 6 weeks ago. That's one of the reasons that countries are playing catch-up here.
Do the panel agree that Russia's presence on the UN Human Rights Council is a farce, and should they not at least be suspended from it? I would like to take that further, William, and say their membership of the Security Council is a farce.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? However, we don't control the United Nations. The whole point of the United Nations is that every country has its rights there. And the rights of Russia are entrenched in it, like our rights are. So however much we hate that fact, that is the reality. There are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia is one of them, just like we are, and they have a veto over any really decisive action, which requires a resolution in the Security Council. So the United Nations is not equipped to deal with this. It can only really operate when all those permanent members are in agreement. And obviously, you have neither Russia nor China willing to act as the United Nations.
So it's pointless, though. It's pointless. The two bad actors, probably the two main bad actors in the entire world, are part of an institution which can veto anything that might deal with bad actors in the world. That feels completely pointless, then, doesn't it?
Well, it's not pointless, of course, but it's not entirely pointless because the United Nations does deal with a whole range of other things. Every day of the week, the United Nations is dealing with something that's going on in passing a resolution about something in stabilizing a country in Africa that has a civil war, this sort of thing. The United Nations is discussing climate change and so on. Those discussions have to go on, even when there's a war. So it's not pointless. But of course, it doesn't fulfill the objective of maintaining international peace and security when one of the leading members of the United Nations destroys international peace and security. And there's never been a way around that other than not having a United Nations. I mean, that's just one of the facts of world politics.